Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going on a journey to explore ancient atomism.
Ooh, sounds intriguing.
It is. It's this idea that everything, literally everything, is made up of these tiny, indivisible things called atoms.
Atoms, huh? Like the stuff we learned in school.
Exactly. But get this, the idea goes way back to the 5th and 4th centuries BC.
Wow, that's ancient.
It is. And the guys who came up with it were these Greek philosophers, Leucippus and Democritus.
I've heard of Democritus. Wasn't he a bit of a, character?
He was. He loved to travel, had a great sense of humor.
So not your typical serious philosopher type.
Not at all. And fun fact, even Karl Marx wrote his doctoral thesis on Democritus.
Seriously, that's wild. Shows you how these ancient ideas still have a hold on us, huh?
Absolutely. So what were they trying to figure out, these atomists?
Well, they were tackling some big questions like, what is reality really made of? How do we know anything for sure?
Fundamental stuff. And their answer was atoms.
Atoms and the void. They believed everything boils down to just those two things.
The void.
Yeah. Basically empty space, the arena where all these atoms are moving around, interacting.
So instead of earth, air, fire, and water, they saw a universe of tiny particles and the space between them.
Right. A universe in constant motion.
Okay, I'm with you so far, but here's where I get tripped up. If atoms are supposed to be unchanging, eternal, how does that explain all the change we see in the world? Things grow, they decay, seasons change. Nothing seems very unchanging.
That's the crux of it. The atomists proposed that change doesn't come from within the atoms themselves, but from how they're arranged and combined.
Like you have the same Lego bricks, but you can build anything you want depending on how you put them together.
Exactly. Different arrangements, different outcomes.
And even back then, they were making those kinds of comparisons.
Oh, yeah. Aristotle, for example, he said the atomists were basically saying that just as different letters create different words, different atoms create different things.
I like that. So the letters APPLE can make apple or pale just by rearranging them?
Precisely. Same idea with atoms.
So an apple and a rock, totally different, but made of the same basic stuff, atoms just arranged differently.
You got it. And this leads to their idea of primary and secondary qualities.
Okay, what's that all about?
Well, primary qualities, things like an atom's size and shape, those are objective. They exist whether we're observing them or not.
Makes sense.
But secondary qualities like color, taste, smell, those are subjective. They arise from how our senses interact with the atoms.
Hold on, are you saying a lemon isn't actually sour? Does a tree falling in the forest make no sound?
Well, according to the atomists, the sourness isn't in the lemon itself, it's our perception of it. Same with the sound. It's the interaction with our senses that creates those qualities.
Whoa, that's kind of trippy. So they were questioning the nature of reality, like what's actually real versus what we perceive.
Exactly. They were already grappling with ideas that are still debated today.
It's like they were laying the groundwork for modern science with all its mind-bending stuff.
Very much so. And their ideas about knowledge are even more fascinating. They believed in two types of knowledge. Dark knowledge from our senses and genuine knowledge from intellect and reason.
So like, don't trust your eyes, trust your brain.
In a way, yeah. They weren't dismissing the senses entirely, but they were saying that our senses can be unreliable. They could deceive us.
Okay, so how did they explain how we perceive things if our senses are so iffy?
They came up with this theory of idola. Think of them like tiny atomic imprints that fly off objects and enter our senses.
So like little atomic snapshots.
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah.
And they said these idolas are constantly bombarding us, which is why our perceptions can be so easily distorted.
Like those optical illusions where you see one thing, but it's actually something else entirely.
Exactly. That's why they stress the importance of genuine knowledge, using reason to go beyond those sensory limitations.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. Atoms in the void, these idolas flying around, and then using our brains to make sense of it all.
It's a surprisingly comprehensive system, especially given how long ago it was developed.
It really is. And speaking of looking at things in a new way, are you ready for one of their most radical ideas?
Hit me with it.
The soul.
Ooh, okay, lay it on me.
Remember, they were materialists. Everything is made of atoms, right? Well, that includes the soul.
Whoa, so no fluffy clouds and harps for them?
Nope. They believe the soul is made of these superfine, smooth atoms, kind of like fire that can move through and animate the body.
So no separate realm for the soul, just different atoms doing their thing.
Exactly. And life itself, for them, was basically breathing, a process of atomic exchange and movement.
Interesting. So what happens when we die? Do the soul atoms just like dissipate?
That's what they believe. Death was just the dispersal of those atoms back into the universe.
Makes you think. And did they say anything about, like, differences between human and animal souls?
There's some ambiguity there, but it definitely raises questions about consciousness, what makes us human, all that good stuff.
Yeah. Heavy stuff indeed. So they tackled reality, knowledge, the soul. Did they have anything to say about how we should actually live our lives? Like ethics, morality, all that.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where things get even more interesting, because their ethical ideas might seem a bit surprising given their whole atomism thing.
Okay, you've got my attention. How so?
Well, if everything is determined by the movements of atoms, where does free will fit in? How can we be held responsible for our actions?
Ah, the age-old question of determinism versus free will, a real head-scratcher.
It is. But let's hear what they had to say about ethics. They believed true happiness wasn't about chasing fleeting pleasures.
So not just about having a good time.
Nope. It was about achieving the state of cheerfulness or well-being. They called it euthymia.
Euthymia sounds pretty zen.
It kind of is. And they believed it involved practicing moderation, controlling your desires, prioritizing knowledge and virtue over physical pleasures.
So it was more about inner peace and contentment than indulging every whim.
Exactly. But here's the kicker. If our actions are just atoms bumping around, how can we choose to be moderate or virtuous?
Right, that's the puzzle. Even within this materialist framework, they seem to acknowledge some level of choice, some agency we have over our own lives.
So maybe they saw a way for free will to exist even within this world governed by atomic movements.
Perhaps. Remember, they were pioneers, grappling with these complex ideas using the tools and language they had available.
It's fascinating to think about how these debates are still ongoing today.
It is. And speaking of debates, what about their political views? They did have some thoughts on that. Right?
Oh, yeah. And they might surprise you. Given the time period they were living in, they were actually big proponents of democracy.
Really? You're kidding. That's pretty progressive for ancient Greece.
Right. And they valued it even over personal wealth, believing that justice was the foundation of a well-functioning society.
So they saw a connection between democracy and this idea of justice.
Definitely. And remember, they believed in atoms in the void, so it wasn't about every individual atom fending for itself. They emphasized collective responsibility, working together for the common good.
Interesting. So even with their atomic worldview, they saw the importance of community and shared goals.
Exactly. But, of course, Athenian democracy wasn't perfect. Even back then, women couldn't vote. There was slavery. It definitely had its issues.
Yeah, we have to keep that historical context in mind.
Absolutely. But compared to other systems of the time, it was pretty radical. It challenged the idea that power should be concentrated in the hands of a few.
So even with its flaws, Democritus saw value in that system.
He did. He actually said that poverty in a democracy was preferable to well-being under a powerful ruler. He really valued freedom and autonomy.
That's a pretty powerful statement. It speaks to how much he valued individual liberty and self-determination.
It does, and it circles back to that tension between determinism and free will. How can you advocate for democracy and individual choice if everything is just atoms bumping around?
Right. It's almost like they were trying to reconcile this world governed by predictable atomic movements with the unpredictable nature of human behavior.
It's a mind-bending paradox. But for now, I think we need to shift gears a bit and dive deeper into their theory of knowledge.
Sounds good to me. I'm ready for more mind-bending.
Great. Because they talked about those tiny atomic imprints. I still have some questions about those.
I get it. They do sound a bit mysterious, almost like something out of a ghost story.
Yeah. But they were materialists through and through, so no actual ghosts involved, right?
Absolutely. So what exactly were these idola and how did they work? Well, they believed that idola were physical imprints of objects made of atoms that travel through the void.
Okay, so like miniature atomic replicas flying through the air.
Pretty much. And when these idolas reach our senses, that's how we perceive the world around us.
So it's not the objects themselves that have those qualities, but the interaction between our senses and the idola.
That's exactly it. And it's a key reason why they warned against relying too much on our senses for knowledge.
Because our perceptions can be distorted.
Exactly. Distance, lighting, even our own individual sensitivities can all affect how we perceive the idola.
Kind of like how a straw looks bent in a glass of water. The straw itself isn't bent, but the way light refracts through the water makes it appear that way.
Perfect analogy. Our senses are constantly bombarded by these potentially warped idolas.
Which is why they emphasized genuine knowledge. using reason to go beyond those sensory limitations.
Right. It's about using our minds to filter out the noise and understand the true nature of things.
So our senses aren't useless, but we need to use our brains to interpret the information they provide.
Precisely. And this is where their theory of knowledge gets really interesting. They believe that reason could help us transcend those limitations and gain a deeper understanding of the atomic structure of reality.
So it's not just about observing the world, but about using our minds to understand the underlying mechanisms driving everything.
Exactly. And it even foreshadows some of the methods of modern science, how scientists use instruments to extend our senses, to see things we couldn't otherwise.
That's a great connection. It really highlights how forward-thinking they were.
It does. But it's important to remember they weren't the only ones pondering these big questions. Ancient Greece was a hotbed of intellectual activity.
Right, so they weren't working in isolation. They were part of a larger philosophical conversation.
Exactly. There are all sorts of different theories about reality floating around back then.
Like, what were some of the other ideas out there?
Well, you had philosophers like Parmenides, who believed in a single, unchanging reality. Then you had Empedocles with his four elements, earth, air, fire, and water. And then Heraclitus, who emphasized the ever-changing nature of reality. You cannot step twice into the same river, he said.
Wow, so a real diversity of thought.
Definitely. And the atomists, with their radical ideas, were right in the thick of it, shaking things up.
It's amazing to think about how these ancient ideas are still relevant today.
It is. It shows the enduring power of philosophy. But before we go too far, we should acknowledge that we only have fragments of their work. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Right, we're getting a glimpse, but not the whole picture.
Exactly. But even with those limitations, their ideas offer so much to think about.
They really do. So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, the atomists were pioneers in developing a materialist view of the universe, rejecting supernatural explanations, and paving the way for a more scientific understanding of the world.
And they really emphasize the importance of reason and critical thinking in our search for knowledge, recognizing that our senses can be tricky.
They also applied their ideas to questions about the soul, ethics, politics, even the divine, providing us with a lot to ponder, even today.
I'm definitely looking at the world around me with new eyes after this, all those atoms interacting and doing their thing.
That's the beauty of philosophy. It can really change how we see the world.
It can. So as our listeners continue their own explorations, what final thought would you leave them with?
I think the atomists would encourage us to stay curious, to question everything, and to never stop seeking knowledge. Democritus supposedly said, "A life without investigation is not worth living." So keep exploring and keep diving deep into the world of ideas.
Well said. Stay curious, everyone, and remember, even this podcast is made of atoms.
Welcome back to our deep dive into ancient atomism. Last time we were talking about Democritus and his surprising support for democracy. Kind of ahead of his time, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. For someone living in ancient Greece, that was a pretty radical stance.
It makes you wonder what led him to that conclusion.
Well, to understand that, I think we need to consider the social context. Like, what was it like living in ancient Greece?
Right, the polis, the city-state, it was everything for them, wasn't it?
Exactly. It wasn't just a place to live. It was their whole world. Work, politics, social life, everything revolved around the polis.
And being a citizen wasn't just about voting. It was about active participation.
Right.
Absolutely. Citizenship came with responsibilities, duties to the community.
So it wasn't just about individual freedom, but about working together for the common good.
Exactly. And that idea of communal responsibility is woven into Democritus's political thought. He believed a just society needed citizens to act virtuously for the benefit of everyone.
So even though they believed in these tiny, independent atoms as the building blocks of reality, their political philosophy wasn't about every individual just looking out for themselves.
Not at all. He saw justice as the foundation of a strong society, and that justice required active participation, like everyone had to play their part.
It's like tending a garden. You can't just plant the seeds and expect everything to flourish. You got to water it, weed it, take care of it.
That's a great analogy. And Democritus believed that democracy, with its emphasis on citizen involvement, was the best system for cultivating that kind of justice.
But Athenian democracy back then, it was pretty limited compared to our modern ideas of democracy, right? I mean, women couldn't vote, there was slavery.
That's true. We can't ignore that historical context. But compared to other systems of the time, Athenian democracy was revolutionary.
So it was a step in the right direction.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It challenged the idea that only a select few should hold power.
So, while imperfect, Democritus saw the potential in that system.
He did. He even went so far as to say that being poor in a democracy was better than living comfortably under a tyrant.
Wow, he really put a high value on freedom and autonomy.
He did. Which brings us back to that whole determinism versus free will thing. If everything is governed by the movements of atoms, how can you also champion democracy and individual choice?
It seems contradictory. Was he just being inconsistent?
Not necessarily. We have to remember they didn't have the same understanding of determinism and free will that we do today. They were exploring these concepts for the first time.
So maybe they saw a way for those ideas to coexist, kind of like how we can make choices even though we know we're bound by the laws of physics?
That's a good way to think about it. It's a complex issue that still sparks debate today.
It is. But for now, I'd love to shift gears a bit and delve deeper into their theory of knowledge.
Sure. What specifically are you curious about?
Well, we talked about those idola before, those atomic imprints that fly off objects. I still find those a bit mysterious.
I understand they do sound a bit strange, like something out of a science fiction story. But remember, the atomists were all about material explanations.
Right, no ghosts or spirits, but what exactly were these idola made of and how did they work?
They believed idola were physical imprints made of atoms that traveled through the void and interacted with our senses.
So like tiny, invisible atomic sculptures carrying information about the objects they came from.
Exactly. And different shapes and arrangements of atoms in those idola would create different sensations.
So a smooth, round atom might create a sensation of sweetness, while a sharp, jagged one might be perceived as bitterness.
You got it. The objects themselves don't actually possess those qualities. It's the interaction between the idola and our senses that produces our perception.
It's all about interpretation, then.
Precisely. And this is why they cautioned against relying solely on our senses for knowledge. They knew our perceptions could be easily distorted.
Because of things like distance, lighting, even our own individual sensitivities.
Right. All those factors could influence how we experience those idolas.
Makes sense. It's like that classic example of the straw looking bent in a glass of water. It's not actually bent, it just looks that way because of the way light bends.
Perfect analogy. Our senses are constantly being bombarded by these potentially misleading idola.
So how do we overcome those limitations?
That's where genuine knowledge comes in. Knowledge derives from reason and intellect. It's about using our minds to go beyond those sensory illusions.
So it's not that our senses are useless, but we need to use our brains to make sense of the data they provide.
Exactly. And this is where their theory of knowledge gets really fascinating. They believe that reason could help us transcend those limitations and understand the true atomic structure of reality.
So it's not just about passively observing, it's about actively engaging with the world, using our intellect to decipher its underlying mechanisms.
Exactly. And, it even foreshadows some of the methods of modern science. Think about how scientists use tools to extend our senses, to see things that are normally invisible to us.
It's like they're trying to access that genuine knowledge the atomists talked about.
Right. Knowledge that lies beyond our immediate sensory experience.
That's a great point. But were they the only ones trying to figure out all this stuff? Were other philosophers proposing alternative theories?
Oh, absolutely. Ancient Greece was a real melting pot of ideas. Thinkers were constantly debating and challenging each other.
So what were some of the other competing theories?
Well, you had philosophers like Parmenides, who believed in a single, unchanging reality. Then there was Empedocles with his four elements, earth, air, fire, and water. And of course, Heraclitus, who emphasized the constant flux and change of everything.
It seems like everyone had a different take on the nature of existence.
They did. And the atomists, with their radical theory of atoms and the void, were right there in the mix, stirring things up.
It's incredible to think that these ancient debates are still relevant today.
It speaks to the enduring power of these philosophical questions. But before we get too carried away, it's important to remember we're working with limited information. We only have fragments of their writings.
Right. It's like trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Exactly. But even with those limitations, the atomists' ideas offer so much to think about.
They really do. So as we wrap up this part of our exploration, what are some key things to keep in mind about their philosophy?
Well, first and foremost, They were pioneers in developing a materialist and mechanistic view of the universe, rejecting supernatural explanations in favor of understanding reality in terms of physical processes.
And they were also ahead of their time in recognizing the limitations of our senses and stressing the importance of reason and critical thinking.
They understood that our perceptions can be misleading and that we need to use our minds to make sense of the world around us.
It's not enough to just observe. We have to engage our intellect to really understand what's going on.
Precisely. And their ideas about the soul, ethics, politics, even the divine, offer valuable insights into these enduring human questions.
It's amazing how these ancient thinkers can still make us question our assumptions and challenge us to think differently.
It is. And it's a reminder that philosophy is an ongoing conversation. We're still grappling with many of the same questions they raised thousands of years ago.
So true. Now, I'm curious, did they have anything to say about how we should live our lives? Did their philosophy extend to ethics and morality?
Absolutely. And this is where their idea of achieving euthymia comes into play. Remember that state of cheerfulness or well-being we talked about before.
Right. They emphasized moderation, self-control, prioritizing knowledge and virtue over physical pleasures, all that good stuff.
Exactly. And they believed this wasn't just some airy-fairy ideal. It was rooted in a deep understanding of the natural world.
So living in accordance with nature meant understanding and accepting the atomic reality of the universe.
Right. It's about using reason to grasp the nature of things, including its inherent limitations, and then making choices that align with that understanding.
So it's not about passively accepting fate, but about making wise choices within the constraints of reality.
Exactly. And this involves cultivating virtues like moderation, justice, and wisdom. They saw these virtues as essential for navigating life in a world governed by atoms and the void.
So understanding the atomic nature of reality could actually guide us toward a more fulfilling and ethical life.
That was their belief. They saw a connection between our understanding of the universe and how we should live our lives.
But if everything is just atoms bumping around randomly, where does morality come from? How can you even talk about right and wrong in a universe without inherent purpose?
That's a question that's been debated for centuries. Some argue that their ethical system clashes with their materialist metaphysics.
Like, can you really build a stable system of ethics on a foundation of atoms and chance?
It's a tough one. But on the other hand, they were pioneers in developing a secular, naturalistic account of morality.
Right. They didn't rely on gods or divine commands. They tried to ground ethics in our understanding of the natural world.
They were truly groundbreaking in that sense, trying to figure out how to live meaningful, ethical lives without appealing to the supernatural.
That's pretty impressive. So even if their answers weren't always perfect, they were asking the right questions, pushing the boundaries of thought.
They were. They challenged conventional wisdom, sparked debate, and left behind a legacy of ideas that still resonate with us today.
It's amazing how relevant their ideas still are, considering they lived over 2,000 years ago.
It is, and I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of asking difficult questions, challenging our assumptions, and never stopping our exploration of the universe and our place in it.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of ancient atomism. We've covered a lot of ground, from those tiny atoms to their thoughts on the soul and even democracy, but there's one more fascinating piece to explore.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What's that?
Their concept of the divine.
Okay, now that's interesting, especially considering they believed in a purely material universe, right? No gods hanging out on Mount Olympus.
Exactly. They weren't into those traditional anthropomorphic gods, no divine intervention for them.
But they still had a concept of the divine. How does that fit in with their whole materialist thing?
It's a good question, and it might surprise you. They identified the divine with intelligence, reason, and they believed this intelligence was embodied in a special type of atom.
Hold on, intelligent atoms. Are we talking about, like, brainy particles?
Sort of. They believed these atoms were spherical, fiery, the most mobile and pervasive of all.
So instead of gods in a heavenly realm, they had these super smart atoms zipping around the cosmos.
That's a simplified way to put it. But yeah, they believed these atoms were responsible for the order and structure of the universe, even though they didn't act with conscious intent.
So it's like a kind of cosmic intelligence that emerges naturally from the interactions of these special atoms. Fascinating. But if these atoms are everywhere, does that mean everything is divine? Is a rock divine?
That's a question they didn't fully address, but they mainly focused on human intelligence and the soul, seeing those as the highest expressions of the divine.
So humans, with our complex reasoning abilities, are at the top of the divinity ladder.
It seems that way, but their theory definitely leaves open the possibility that some form of intelligence, and therefore divinity, could exist in other parts of the natural world as well.
So it's not a strict separation between sacred and profane, more like a spectrum of intelligence and divinity.
Exactly. It's a surprisingly nuanced view for a philosophy rooted in materialism.
It is. And this idea of a cosmic intelligence permeating all things, it's popped up throughout history, from the Stoics to the Transcendentalists.
It's a powerful idea for sure. But as we wrap up our exploration of the Atomists, we should acknowledge that we're working with limited information. We only have fragments of their writings. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces.
Right, we're getting glimpses, but not the whole picture.
Exactly. But even with those limitations, their ideas are incredibly thought-provoking. They make us question our assumptions about the universe and our place in it.
They do. So as we reach the end of our deep dive, what are some key takeaways you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the atomists would want us to remember that a life without questioning, without exploring, isn't really a life worth living. They encouraged us to embrace curiosity and to never stop seeking knowledge.
Well said. They were true pioneers, paving the way for a more scientific understanding of the world, emphasizing the importance of reason and critical thinking, and challenging us to confront those big questions about reality, knowledge, and our place in the cosmos.
They really pushed the boundaries of thought, and their legacy continues to inspire us today.
Absolutely. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those atoms buzzing.
Stay curious, everyone, and until next time, keep on diving deep.